Hello and welcome to the ASIS Economist Board, where we're going to discuss current economic factors as they relate to our environment, and we'll specifically focus on industrial production. We have a number of different industrial production models that we look at, approximately 18 to 20 different economic indices to develop these models going back about 20 years. In this video and the seven related, we have 7 total subsectors that we look at, a couple that we'll actually look at within the first video. We're going to dig into what's driving each of our forecasting models. And we're going to do a little something different this time. We're going to dive into some of the accuracy and some of the background on the models up front. And by way of getting going, I'm John Nelson with MNA, and we've got Keith Prater of Armada with us today. Good morning, Keith.
Hey, good morning. Good morning. Great to be here.
And glad you, like I said, we're going to take a little bit of a different dive into what we've done before. Typically, we jump right into the models, but this time we're going to spend a little bit of time on the accuracy. Keith and I were having a conversation up front about what's going on. Why does the accuracy matter? Can you believe the models and everything? And so we thought maybe that we would start off with that. And Keith, if it's good with you, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got our, of course, this is for those of you who get the ASIS, this is the opening slide deck. For those of you who don't normally get it, this is our opening slide. And we're going to go right in here where we stick our performance scorecard up front. And, everybody throws a caveat out there. So I have to throw a caveat out there. This is not the current picture entirely. It's 2/3 of the current picture. And so what I mean by that is that 1 month out, those are the numbers. 1 month out, we're at overall, you can see we're about 97% accurate. 3 months out, we're at 93% accurate, and 6 months out, 94% accurate. But I got to caveat that those 6 months figures are from back up till June. And the reason why up to June is at that point where we get most of our data is from the Federal Reserve out of St. Louis, their economic data. And they reset the indices. They redid how they calculate the formulas. And so up to that point, those were the numbers for the 6 month out data. And the reason why that's important is we can't calculate our 6 month data now because it would go back before they reset the indices. So it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. We're about ready to get to the point where we can calculate that. But as Keith mentioned to me before, we kind of want to understand, what does that accuracy mean? Well, what that accuracy means is, let's say the 6 month data. At 6 months, at time zero, we project, let's say it is December. 6 months from now would be June. In December, we projected a specific index number for IP man. And what we do is we compare the actual index number when we get to June. We compare the actual index number that we hit in June to the index number that we projected in December of all the way back in 2021. And see how close we are. And those numbers for all those sectors, you can see that was what those 6 month numbers are. So we were 94% accurate. And Keith, there were a couple things going on during that time.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I think you and I talked off camera about doing this is a lot of other folks are throwing their accuracy numbers out there, and they do the calculations a different way. And we decided when we started this that we just wanted to be very upfront with everybody, and we just wanted to see how good we were. So that's why if we say the index is going to be 102.1 in June and it comes in at 101.9, that's what we measure the accuracy off of, as you said. Others are going to take a 95% confidence interval or a 90% confidence interval, and they're going to say, how close did they hit to within that interval? And if they hit within, one end of that interval, they're going to consider themselves to be 100% accurate. And so it's cheating a little bit. It's saying there's a cone out there, and if I just get close to that cone, I predicted it 100%. We're not doing that. We're basically saying I said it would be 100, and how far off of 100 are we by the time we get there? So anyway, the reason why we did this today, John, was just because when we look at the models themselves for the first time in about 3 months, we've got a little bit of consistency. So as your question, was alluding to the fact that 6 months ago, if you think about it, we were entering a war. We had tremendous drought situations like throughout Europe where the Rhine River went dry, where you couldn't move barge traffic. You had industrial production companies that were completely shutting down along the Rhine. We also had the same situation along the Yangtze River down in southern China. You also have COVID lockdowns. So we've had these tremendous, what we call black swan events that have literally roiled and just really impacted the global industrial production landscape. And what we feel good about is the fact that by using the kind of modeling strategy that we're using on these particular models, it allows us to process thousands and thousands and thousands of different metrics overall to really understand what the operating environment looks like. And so we've hit the point now where, despite all those black swan events, not only were the models that we were using back then showing a 90% accuracy level or better, but now we're at a point where moving forward, we really trust what we're seeing, and we're getting a lot of stability out of the models themselves. So we wanted to have this little quick discussion because I feel bad in one sense that when we look at the models, we compare them month over month, you're going to see a lot of consistency. Hey, we said last month, here's what the curve looked like. This month, wow, looks the same. So, we're starting to get a little bit of, a lot of confidence in what the models are showing us. And so we kind of have to believe what we're seeing. And so if it shows recession first half of 2023, unfortunately, we're, pretty much banking on it at this stage. So that's the backdrop. Again, we're still excited about the stability of the models and the performance of the models, the accuracy of the models, despite this incredible volatility that we've had over the first 6 months of really this particular year. So,
All right, let's take a look at one of those boring stories, if you will, about the models looking exactly the same as they look from month to month. And basically that gets us, here we go, once, twice. Here we go, industrial production. Here's our look at industrial production. And if you compare the two charts, you got our current forecast there on the left based on the October data. We have the forecast of, by the way, if you're ever wondering, why do we call them the October charts? We're putting this into November ASIS. It's because the data is based on the data that came out in October. The November data is not due out for a few more days. So we'll run the models again and re-update everything, so that we want to be, so you understand that this is data that drove this model as of October. But anyway, if you compare these two models, you take a look at September and October, they look remarkably similar. The endpoints are endpoints all the way out there where we said the model's going to trail off or complete. They're within just a couple points of one another. So what we're seeing in October is only about 2 points different than what we're seeing, we said in September, for 18 months out. So in both cases, Keith, as you alluded to, we're looking at recessionary type of period that happens during, starts happening in second quarter into third of next year.
Yeah, exactly. So the two big sections I would look at here in the periods would be, number one, it is calling for recession between sometime in Q4 and between the middle half of next year, followed by recovery that kind of stretches now into 2014. So it's it's not a great story, but it is kind of what it is. Now, what's interesting about this is we do not incorporate other forecasts into our models, right? So what we're doing is we're looking at the operating environment, we're looking at current inventories, and we're looking at current performance of those sectors that drive demand for manufacturing. And we allow the models then to statistically figure out which ones are important, which ones are not, which ones are correlated, which ones are not correlated. And so I say that because our model here is showing some similar performance to what you're hearing out of the Federal Reserve and what we're hearing out of some of the big Wall Street banks when they're talking about a first half of 2023 downturn, followed by a little bit of recovery and a little bit of acceleration in the back half of 23, spilling over into 24. And so we're consistently getting this curve right now, which tells us that this is probably, reinforcing and confirming what I think a lot of us already knew.
Yeah, and if we would have put the August curve up here, it'd look remarkably similar.
Right.
Maybe just a couple points different.
Right.
If you look at the long term, yeah, you definitely can see the dip. It's not nearly as bad as what it was there in the midst of the worst of COVID. But you can see it takes us down pretty far, but does return pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things. And then when you take a look at it overall, where that 20-year trend line is, at the end of this downturn and then backswing, we get right back about where we should be on the overall trend line.
Yeah, I had to talk myself off a cliff when I was looking at these models early on, as you and I were working on this together, because you look at this and you think, oh my gosh, this is really dramatic. But think about the point scale. So from peak to trough during the Great Recession, industrial production and manufacturing lost about 20 points. In the shock that we had during the lockdown, we also lost about 20 points. Here, we're calling for a recession, and we're calling for somewhere around, maybe 10 points tops, talking about, from peak to trough, maybe an 8 to 10 point dip. So, just to put it all in perspective and put it into a scale, that's what we're calling for. It's not like the second Great Recession. It's not quite a soft landing, but it would be what we would consider to be an official recession of some duration. It looks like approximately 6 months, and then we're out. We're climbing, and we're back into kind of a growth mode.
And you mentioned taking a look at this and looking at the magnitude of change here. Also I always like to mention scale. Whenever you look at these charts, what we try to do to give you the clearest picture possible is to crunch the data, or actually you crunch the axes down to where you see the greatest amount of change in the data. Notice we start the bottom of this at 80, not at 0, but at 80.
Right.
So to try to give you a better feel of what's really going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't quite create a flat line if we were to take the scale to 0, but you're right. It does flatten it out a little bit, and it doesn't make it look as dramatic.
Right.
Yeah.
So then here, year over year, again, our forecast values are in the kind of the deep red dashed line moving forward. Everything else is constant. You can see that dip and moving forward over the next 12 months into the following years.
Yeah, we really do like to do that, because when we look at the outlook, we kind of try to compare it to where we are in the previous years. And so, it's still, even on the backside of this, it's still pretty weak compared to the operating environment that each of you would have enjoyed over the last 4 years. So that's the takeaway.
And just a reminder, we do always, just so you understand what the curves look like, or where things are coming from, we always put the previous 3 months of the year prior up there. So notice January is all the way out here. Well, I think you can see my mouse, and then but October to December precedes it, and it's going to be repeated over and over.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things that are further upstream in industrial production. Let's take a look at primary metals, Keith. Again, like industrial production, telling a similar story. The exception being maybe a little bit better outlook for primary metals, in that we're actually improved by about a good solid 5 points on the back end, and actually the trough is up for about 5 points. But again, still showing that same recessionary period at the same time.
Yeah, so here's where I'm going to use an anecdote. I'm going to go off the models for a second so you can see what the models are showing. Interesting scenario building worldwide. So a lot of manufacturing sectors around the world are in contraction. So 15 countries right now have manufacturing sectors that are basically in recession, if you will. And what's interesting though is at the same time, when we look at primary metals, when we look at inventories of primary metals around the world, you look at aluminum, zinc, copper, nickel, all of those inputs that go into manufacturing. It's interesting because most inventory levels today are near 2-decade lows. So we see, if I go look at nickel inventories today, they're almost sitting at their lowest levels in more than 20 years. But what's interesting is prices for those metals are also coming down. So if you remember Econ 101, you typically don't have supply and demand going the same direction, right? They're typically inversely related. And right now, because we have a lack of demand worldwide, you're seeing inventories dive, and at the same time, prices are coming down with them. And it's interesting because we're hearing rumors that China may be pursuing easing lockdowns, easing the way they approach COVID. So moving away from maybe a zero COVID policy to something that looks a little more dynamic and a little more open, if you will. What that means is, though, that they're going to start stockpiling some of those raw materials to start putting them back into production. They're going to start getting ready, for this next wave that would come. Maybe if the world goes into a bit of a recession in the first half of next year, then we start to climb back out of it next year. That's what the setup is. And so at some point in time here, very quickly, we're going to suddenly get this reverse spike where, we think inflation's coming down, and all of a sudden we see an increase in demand for things like nickel, zinc, copper, and the inventory is not going to be there. We're not going to have the inventory to be able to support that growth, and we're going to get right back into the same type of supply chain scramble that we were in 2021. So I only throw that out there as a backdrop because I'm hearing, as I meet with construction firms, I'm meeting with developers, manufacturers, they're all kind of starting to figure out that they're going to have to start playing a little bit of a game next year in how they manage primary metals. And that could create a really weird set of green shoots that we're not expecting. They're almost like black swan events, if you will, because we can't necessarily predict today exactly what's going to happen in those markets. So for now, what the models are reading is exactly the environment we've got. Primary metals in this particular context typically follows some of the other manufacturing models, but because this is a key input for it. But just want to throw that out there because early next year, we could get some weird little green shoots that we're trying to explain, trying to figure out why that's happening. Economists will be scrambling, trying to explain away why they were wrong. And not that these models will be wrong, but I'm just saying that there could be some interesting green shoots out there for some of our members, some of our subscribers, the people who are watching this. Sure. They could create some growth, maybe outside of what the models are showing. So just an interesting backdrop.
Yep. Let's move a little further in on the supply chain, closer to industrial production from primary metal, ultimately source materials. Let's go ahead and take a look at fabricated metal. And fabricated metal's doing pretty much the same thing. Again, you're seeing the drop. You don't see as much of a rise. One thing I kind of want to point out is right here in this area, note where we're saying it's going to end up is at about that 92 point. Before we were saying it's about 94. So, I mean, you're really within 2 points of one another, 18 months out. That's awfully consistent story that we're saying. The drop, it looks like it might be a little bit more of a steeper drop, but when you take a look at it scale wise, we topped this diagram out at 105, where this diagram was at 110. So that might actually cause more of that change in the scale than anything else. But again, same consistent story, Keith. We got a drop. We got a little bit of softening on the back end of it, but with fabricated metals, not quite as much of a rise.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because this sector is also made up of a lot of small companies, a lot of small fabricators, and job shops, that that kind of firm. And it's interesting because when you look at small business surveys, they're all kind of hinting that they're getting ready for this particular kind of curve, this particular kind of demand environment, and they're kind of battening down the hatches a little bit. But most of them are trying to hang on to good labor because it was so hard to recruit it, so hard to hang on to it prior. So going to try and hang on to their labor, and but they're kind of pulling back on CapEx spending, kind of pulling back a little bit on investment, kind of conserving cash a little bit, and that's consistent really with what we see in the model. So yeah, not much more to add there.
Yeah, one thing interesting, I was going to take a look at the long term on this. We saw that big dip, but I do want to point out, big dips are common in this sector. You know, non-recessionary period, you had a big dip right here in that 2014 to 16 timeframe. You know, steeper now what we're calling, but the magnitude of it is pretty similar. And then you had another one starting in mid 2018 to 2019, and you can see that thing was going to happen regardless of COVID, because COVID doesn't start until here. So the volatility that we're seeing, the overall trend line in this is negative, unlike so many of our other sectors.
Yeah, you know, those are big events that kind of created some of that before. So like you think about pre-2014 leading up to that, we kind of had that cash for clunkers moment. And so the fabricated metal sector kind of helping with automotive production and automotive demand coming out of that. And then in 2018 and 2019, we're in the middle of trade wars. We had launched trade wars with China. And so you did have a lot of fabricated metal production kind of shifting a little more domesticated or, you know, domestic sourcing. So you just, I don't know, you know, we had those little moments. And then of course, coming out of the lockdowns, you just had this surge and recovery and demand, or there's all this pent up activity that we needed to recover from. And so we had a little bit of a surge. So,
Right.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, it just volatility and big events can really sway, you know, this particular industry. But yeah, anyway, it's interesting.
All right. Well, that concludes our look at industrial production and the main part of its supply chain as it deals with metals. And we hope you join us next month.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.